We have to put the amount of technology and development and energy that is being put on fossil fuels to destroy the world and to collapse agriculture. We have to put all that into a different form of transformation of food production. It's going to have to be very, very different.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Climate Emergency Forum series. Today, we'll be discussing surviving food and water insecurity. But we've talked about this topic a lot. We've talked about water scarcity on its own. We've talked about food scarcity on its own. And when the team was at COP26 in Glasgow, we talked about food and water insecurity. And now we're going to be talking about that, but we'll talk about it in terms of coming somewhat from a solution-oriented direction. And before we do that, I do, however, want to point out just a few things for us to bear in mind before we go into the solutions. So to review the numbers, 72% of all water withdrawals, and when I say water withdrawals, I mean the use from aquifers, water being pumped from underground. 72% of all of that water goes straight to agriculture. So you can see the intimate connection between water and food. Obviously, we cannot have food without water. The converse is true as well. Now, there's almost 30% of the water that is not used for food production. So 16% of the water that we have is used by households, municipalities for services. We all know we take showers, we water the lawn. Unfortunately, turf grass is still used in huge parts of the world. It uses a tremendous amount of water. Flushing toilets, dishwasher, and 12% is used by industries. Think about some of these really intensive water use industries, such as fracking, that uses a tremendous amount of water to get all of that gas out from underground. What a waste of water. Some may say that it's a greener way of obtaining energy. It still uses a tremendous amount of water. So, there are 800 million people on the planet, and I think that this is a mild estimate. There are 800 million people on the planet who live with food insecurity every single day. That's almost 1 billion people. It's a lot of people. And there are 2.3 billion people who live in water-stressed countries. That means there are a lot of people living in countries that have a great deal of insecurity about where their fresh water is going to come from. Now, there's 3.2 billion people who live in agricultural areas specifically dedicated to animal husbandry and growing crops, where there's very high water shortages as well. And 1.2 billion people, and this is about 1/6 of the world population, live in severely drought-ridden, or shall we say water-constrained agricultural areas. It's really, really frightening. 450 million children live in areas of high water vulnerability. Now, I don't want us to get lost in all of these numbers. When we throw away these 100 millions and billions, it's easy to lose track of what we're talking about. What we're talking about is lives. We're talking about real lives. There are about 4 billion people, or we can say 2/3 of the world's global population, that experience severe water scarcity at least 1 month a year. So we really have to start looking at solutions. Now, part of the good news is a lot of this water scarcity, not all of it, but a lot of it is through management. If we can just work on, use this human brain for what it is capable of doing, and find other ways of managing our water, we can really relieve some of these stresses pumping water out of an aquifer is just not a good situation. It leads to too many problems. It leads to sinking land. It leads to, of course, taking water out of the aquifers, and it doesn't get replenished. So again, it's about management. And I want to turn this over to Peter. I know that he's an expert in this field, and hear what he has to say about food and water insecurity.
Thanks, Virginia. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are more people, and there will be a continuing increase in people in a state of poor nourishment and hunger. And that's the latest information from the FAO. The Sustainable Development Goals over the past 15 or 20 years have been somewhat successful in reducing world hunger, but 4 years ago, it started increasing again. And so hunger is on an increase. And unfortunately, it will stay on an increase. And the reason for that is that although we're at 1.12 degrees C at present global warming, despite what everybody hopefully says, 1.5 degrees C is absolutely impossible to avoid. Absolutely impossible. The world will be at 1.5 degrees C. And as the 1.5 degrees C report in 2018 made very clear on food and water security, that is going to be disastrous. The world and governments have to get their act together and start preparing for that. Furthermore, as the chair of the IPCC said, Dr. Hassan Lee at the Glasgow COP26, if global emissions aren't put into decline immediately and rapidly, quote unquote, which they haven't been and they're not going to be, he said 2 degrees C is out of reach. And on that same 1.5 degrees C report, 2 degrees is absolutely catastrophic for the world's food and water security. At 2 degrees C, we're talking about several billion people without enough water. We're talking about at least 2 billion people with their food production in decline, and that would be irreversibly in decline. We had a very important and wake-up report just last month from the FAO. The FAO do a state of the land and water resources for agriculture report annually. This report, which even shocked me, was titled Systems at Breaking Point. So the entire report was explaining that world agricultural systems are at breaking point. And the majority of the report, quite reasonably, was actually pointing out what's happening with climate change on agriculture. And this is adding to the stresses of world land. Now, it also included, of course, land degradation, which has been expanding for years and years and years, but it also pointed to the intensification of industrial agriculture, chemically based and monoculture based, which has been a concern for many of us. In actual fact, some years ago, the FAO did an interesting report in which they said this kind of agriculture may be actually more vulnerable to climate change than even a smallholder agriculture, because they would be more adaptable, and I would certainly agree with that. So for food insecurity, well, there are several sources of food. I mean, we immediately, of course, rush to agriculture and crops, but there's also fish, there's also livestock. I'm trying to encourage, as I think we all are, people to stop eating meat so that they can, so that we can reduce our methane emissions, which are accelerating at an absolutely alarming rate. So hopefully people won't be eating meat, but that's a source of food for a lot of people. And then, of course, there's fisheries. And livestock is affected very adversely by climate change, by temperatures. And in that same 1.5 degrees C report from the IPCC, fisheries was the one thing that really they were very, very definite about. Fisheries are going to be very badly damaged, global fisheries. And so that's a big source of food insecurity. Extreme weather events, of course, extreme heat, drought, but also many years ago, I put together the number of adverse impacts of climate change on agriculture, and there were 20 of them, 20 adverse impacts, many of them still being ignored. So we've got a lot to do, and our governments, again, have to wake up to the fact that we are at 1.5 degrees C. They have to prepare for that, particularly with regards to food and water insecurity, which we are now in. We are now in a state of committed food and water insecurity. That's all of us.
So that's really frightening, Peter. Also, you had mentioned the FAO. I'm wondering if you could share with me, what does that acronym stand for?
Oh, sorry. That's the United Nations based in Rome Food and Agriculture Organization.
Okay. Wow. So if they come out with a report such as that, then they mean business. And I'm guessing that the fish stocks, well, I'm guessing that those are impacted. Is it because of the warming waters?
Yeah, the currents in the water, the vertical exchanging, and also the big currents are, of course, being vastly disturbed. And it's chaotic for the fish. Lots of fish are moving to regions where they're not adapted for. They're moving into regions where there are other species that they've never interacted with. It is a mess for the fish in our ocean.
Right. And this goes back to our program on climate migration. It's not just the human animals that are doing it, but all animals. Paul, what do you got for us?
Yes, thank you, Regina and Peter. So surviving food and water insecurity, you can't really separate food and water because generally, food is embedded water, if you think of it. Water is required by plants to grow, and then the plants are either eaten directly or, feed the animals. So water is sort of behind everything, of course. The risk is that we reach simultaneous crop failures around the globe, say in 5 to 10 years sort of time frame. The UN Sustainable Goals that have made, we've made advancement on a number of these goals in the past, but things seem to have turned around. The worst climate change has become, things like poverty have been increasing, not just poverty, but the inequality, the money, so much more money going to the very, very rich, and even a disappearance of the middle class, but also food security and water security. These UN sustainable goals are heading backwards at the moment. There's nothing like the lack of food to cause civil unrest, many, violent marches, riots. One thing that gets people out into the streets is when they're not able to eat, specifically, more so they're not able to feed their children. People will go without food themselves, but but if they can't feed their children, then society just completely breaks down. And of course, we've talked a lot on this channel, and I'm sure you've read a lot about climate change, mayhem, climate disruption. I'll just say one or two sentences on that. I mean, things are extremely serious. Arctic sea ice is heading out. That's greatly warming the Arctic. It's disrupting the jet stream. So we're getting an increase in the frequency, severity, and duration of extreme weather events. And this is what I say will lead to simultaneous crop failures. Also, for every 1 degree global temperature rise, there's 7% more water vapor in the atmosphere. That water vapor rises up and condenses into the cloud, releasing its stored energy, the latent heat, by some physics called the Clausius-Clapeyron equation. And basically that increased energy in the atmosphere increases the severity of these extreme weather events that we're getting. So what do we do about it? Okay, well, it happens, I can be a bit facetious at first and say, well, 2022 was the time of the setting of the movie, which came out in the 70s, I believe, called Soylent Green. So their solution was that when people die, their bodies are rendered into nutrient bars, which feed the population. That was their, dystopian future idea of how humans can survive. And believe me, rather than have mass amounts of humans dying, things like that will not become inconceivable. Hopefully we have better methods, but things like that will, you can't just laugh and say that would never be done in a starving world. People will go to great lengths to survive. The other thing I've seen recently is a very funny meme, which goes something like, with food shortages, at least we have each other. And there's a picture of the character Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. Of course, he was a cannibal, right? He didn't wait for the people to die to get food from them. Obviously, we need to go to plant-based diets. I mean, when we eat meats, we're eating things that are much higher up on the food chain, and there's so much embedded energy, and there's so much extra work. I mean, we can eat when we eat things lower and lower on the food chain, we can get a lot more of it. We can get all our nutrients and things that we need to survive from it, and it can feed a lot more people than eating the meat. We need to look at things like indoor farming, advancements, and things like vertical farming, especially in urban environments, because that would greatly reduce the transport required for food. If large cities, mega cities, started producing their own food rather than having it imported from rural areas around. And there's lots of different ideas. I mean, water, when we transport water in canals and when it's in reservoirs, there's lots of evaporation. We get lots of losses. So using pipelines for long duration transport of water prevents the evaporation and kind of secures it. If you have water going long distances through canals, it tends to dwindle, and maybe not much reaches the other end. So there's lots of different ideas. There's lots of technologies that we can bring into place. Desalination plants, different techniques to take water directly out of the air in very dry environments, etc. So there's lots of things, and we need to focus on doing these things to give us security in the water and food supply.
Well, thank you for that, Paul, and thank you for taking us from Soylent Green to a modest proposal to vertical farming, because definitely I think vertical farming, there have been a lot of detractors regarding vertical farming, especially the corporatization of it. But our food industry has been corporatized for decades now, so it truly is nothing new. And I do like what you have to say, the mega cities being able to grow their own food, and these vertical farming buildings. I think it's such an interesting thing. And as a point of interest, I live in New York City, and Brooklyn, New York has, I believe, among the most rooftop farms of any other city in the country. So it is being done, it has been done, and it can be done even more. And I would argue, Peter, that, regarding the fish stocks, I mean, we're already at the point where the United States government tells pregnant women not to eat fish. Why? Because of the contamination in the fish may hurt the fetus. But look, the fish is contaminated. Why would we eat food that's contaminated? The fish is contaminated. And then this is also especially in regards to the US. I don't know about other parts of the world, but the beef is contaminated. Virtually all beef in this country is slathered in E. coli. This is why it has to be cooked to a certain temperature before it can be safely eaten. So people watching, please think about it. If you don't want to be vegetarian for your own health, think about your health. It's not about just the moral aspect, but the actual food, the living beings that you're eating is just full of chemicals and many other things. So thank you for that, Paul, and also for Peter for bringing to mind this topic of contaminated food. And I wondered if you wanted to add on to that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, of course, about the contaminated fish and particularly mercury. And the mercury is cumulative, and it's been produced for hundreds of years from burning coal. And mercury gets absolutely everywhere. And that alone is a reason to stop burning coal immediately. Unfortunately, the world is going in exactly the opposite direction. India and China have never, ever burned anything like the amount of coal they're burning today. I want to make just two quick points. Number one, Africa. And I'm very glad that Paul brought up the point of mothers with their children. We're seeing again ghastly photographs from Sudan, northern Kenya. There are millions and millions and millions of people in Africa today on the verge of famine, drought mainly. Africa is going to be absolutely devastated on a continent-wide basis by committed climate change and extreme weather events. They have no irrigation in Africa. So the international community must please get together, right, and look after Africa. We all come out of Africa. They're our ancestors, for heaven's sake. A quick second point, I do agree with Paul. We have to plan massive transformation of agriculture. We have to put the amount of technology and development and energy that is being put on fossil fuels to destroy the world and to collapse agriculture. We have to put all that into a different form of transformation of food production. It's going to have to be very, very different. And we have the science and we have the technologies, Paul's mentioned, vertical farming, urban farming. We have the know-how to be able to do it. But we are throwing away the future. Burning fossil fuels today is burning the food for our children tomorrow. And it's so frustrating because we could do this. We could do this. But of course, we can't do anything unless emissions are put into global decline right away.
Thank you for that urgent call to end the burning of fossil fuels, Peter. And I know this is a very passionate topic for you. So yes, well heated. And I have a question, Paul, since you did bring up vertical farming, and I appreciate that you both are believe that this is the wave of the future. I have heard some detractors say that, food grown in this sort of artificial environment won't have the same nutritional value as food that is grown, say, on an actual farm. Is this true, or is this hand-wringing over nothing?
The thing that's probably most critical to growing good quality food is the quality of the soils, right? The quality, the number of the nutrients in the soils, the quality of the soils, and also interaction of the plants with the with nature around it, with the with insects, with animals, leaving their droppings and stuff, enriching the soils. And soils take a long time to develop naturally, and be very good soils. And of course, we saw huge problems with soil management being done incorrectly and resulting, we're contributing greatly to the Dust Bowl in the 30s when, it was very, very dry, and the soils ended up being, they were degraded so much by farming practices that nothing held them in place. They just got windy and they just were carried miles with the wind, and then the sand and the soils were piled up, in places, and the thickness of the soils was severely degraded. So you have to do things properly. So if you're using vertical farming, you learn sort of on the go. You might have some crops that aren't that healthy. You analyze them and they're missing nutrients or missing things. And then the next crop that you do, you try to correct those problems. And eventually you get, you get much better better yields and much better, but much healthier foods to grow. So it's a learning process. And one thing that I should also mention is we were talking about the oceans and depletion of fish, et cetera. There's some very interesting ideas to try to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere using things like ocean pasture restoration. And we did a session. We've done sessions in the past, and we did one at COP26 on this very thing with Alex Carlin and others. But so basically, the idea is that if you try to put perhaps missing nutrients in parts of the ocean that have plenty of nutrients, yet no significant phytoplankton growth because they're missing one key nutrient, maybe, iron often is the one key nutrient, and that's naturally provided by soils blowing from the deserts, far distances over the oceans, and they carry some sand and soil, and they carry some iron. So when they go into the ocean, there's phytoplankton growth that's seeded by that soil. So we really need to look at this idea of ocean pasture restoration, and that would then we could go into things like applying permaculture methods to the ocean. So you don't have just one crop or one thing like a salmon farm or whatever. You have the whole marine ecosystem building up, and then you can take sustainable amounts of marine life for helping feed people. So we need to consider the overall planet, not just consider, if there's a discussion talking about food and we're focusing that discussion purely on growing on things on the earth, things we can do on the land, then we're missing a vast area of the earth. There's a problem in society, that runs very deeply, that we end up getting a lot of people up at the top that don't have any technology background, don't have any science background, and push policies that aren't science-based. So we need to change that. We need to change our political systems, the things that we value. And people know, you have to have water, to survive. You can't survive more than a few days without water. You can survive a few weeks without food, but no more than a few weeks to 3 weeks or so. And you can only survive a few minutes without air. So all of these things we're contaminating, and we need to put them at the highest priority: the air, the water, and the lands.
Thank you so much. That's such a beautiful thought to end on. And I really like what you said about considering the overall planet. I think so often we have like this laser approach. Let's focus on this one crop. And we see what happened. For example, the Dust Bowl was brought up when it was just cotton. And when there's this laser focus on one thing, it throws everything out of whack. We see this with the human body as well. So the human body is a system of interacting components, just like the planet is. So we can't treat it as one thing to be tackled. It has to be understood and respected and worked with, as you say, as a whole. And when we're able to do that, we can really, really harness the solutions that you both brought up that are absolutely out there. And, it brings a lot of hope to the fore when we think of the ability to draw water out of the humidity in the air, to capture extensive rain events and channel that water into our aquifers. There's so many things that we can be doing to secure our food and water sources for generations to come. And, we have it. It's not that we can't. It's just so far we have not. And let's hope that in the future that we will. And, we have to do all we can to reach out to the powers that be and let them know that, hey, there's a better way. There's a better way for you, for me, and for the youth and the planet. So thank you so much, both of you, for sharing this information. And those of you watching, I hope that it's given you some amount of hope. I know that we had to talk about some difficult topics, but it's important to do that in order to show the problem and then the solution. And if you did learn something, please share this video, hit the like button and subscribe. We'd love to have you with us for the next time at the Climate Emergency Forum. Thank you all for being here with us.